Welcome to today's deep dive. We'll be exploring some EU environmental policies and how they're impacting local communities.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll do that by looking at a couple articles and one report.
Okay.
So to get started, imagine this. You're Carlos, a civil engineer. He lives in a small coastal town in Spain. And he's been noticing a lot of changes
Mm-hmm.
around town, like new recycling bins are popping up everywhere, solar panels are going up on public buildings.
Right.
Even his neighbors are suddenly really into water conservation. So what's going on?
Well, it's interesting because a lot of these local changes Carlos is noticing are actually like small pieces of a much larger puzzle.
Mm-hmm.
The European Union actually has a grand plan for a sustainable future.
So bigger than just Carlos's town, obviously.
Oh, yeah.
So the source material points to the European Green Deal as like the driving force behind all of this. This isn't just some small-scale initiative.
No, not at all. The European Green Deal is very ambitious, like a big framework. Yeah. And it has this goal of making Europe the first climate-neutral continent in the world by 2050.
2050, that seems like a while from now, but
It is.
if you think about everything that needs to change, like in energy, industry, transportation, and agriculture,
Mhm.
it's really not that much time.
No, it's not. And it's not even just about cutting emissions. They also want to promote renewable energy sources,
Right.
protect biodiversity.
Yeah.
And they even talk about creating new green jobs as part of it.
So how does this massive EU-wide plan connect to what Carlos is seeing in his little town in Spain? I mean, are those solar panels and those recycling bins directly related to this Green Deal?
Yeah, they are. Like, take the solar panels, for example. The EU has set these big targets for renewable energy, and those targets then turn into incentives and funding for local governments
Mm-hmm.
to invest in solar projects like the ones on public buildings that Carlos is seeing.
Makes sense.
Yeah, so it's like this ripple effect, starting with EU policy, then going to national action,
Yeah.
and then ending with actual tangible changes in communities.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. So let's talk about this term we keep hearing, climate neutrality.
Yeah.
What does that really mean in practice?
Well, it doesn't mean that we eliminate emissions altogether. Instead, it's about achieving a balance.
Okay.
You can think about it like a scale. So on one side, we have all the greenhouse gases that Europe emits,
Right.
and on the other side of the scale are all the actions to remove or offset those emissions.
Mm-hmm.
So climate neutrality means balancing that scale.
Okay, so it's about finding ways to counterbalance our emissions.
Yeah.
But how does this relate to the larger global effort to fight climate change?
Well, Europe's push for climate neutrality is really a big part of the global effort to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius.
Which is, of course, the goal of the Paris Agreement.
Exactly. The EU is trying to kind of set an example
Mm-hmm.
and show that a major economic bloc can actually hit this goal.
Yeah.
And they hope that will lead the way for others to follow.
So leadership on a global scale. But how does all of this relate to our everyday choices? I mean, what we do right here, right now.
Well, that's where it gets really interesting. Every choice we make, whether it's how we heat our homes or the transportation we use,
Mm-hmm.
the food we buy, or even how much we throw away,
Right.
all of that contributes to each of our own individual carbon footprints.
So our seemingly small choices have a role to play in all of this.
Absolutely. So if we go back to Carlos
Mm-hmm.
and his town again,
Mm-hmm.
all those changes that he's seeing, energy-efficient buildings,
Mm-hmm.
the improved waste management, and the focus on public transport,
Right.
those are all actions that help with that climate neutrality objective.
It's like empowering people to actually do something about it.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so the EU is pushing for climate neutrality.
Mm-hmm.
They want to use this idea of a circular economy to promote sustainability.
Right.
And those are already causing visible changes in communities all over Europe.
That's right.
Now, this circular economy is a term that pops up a lot in our source material. So is it just like a fancy way to say recycling?
Well, it's related to recycling,
Okay.
but it's actually a much broader concept.
Okay.
So imagine a circle instead of a straight line. The circular economy is about moving away from that old take, make, dispose way of doing things
Right.
and moving toward a system where we reduce waste first
Mm-hmm.
and then reuse products and reclaim materials whenever possible.
So it's about like closing the loop, making the entire process sustainable.
Yes, exactly. And Carlos's town is doing some of that with their recycling programs. But the circular economy is much bigger than just separating your trash.
Yeah.
It means fixing things and giving them away instead of throwing them out.
Hmm.
And it means reducing our reliance on new raw materials.
So changing how we design and use things in the first place.
Exactly. It's a systemic change that requires innovation at all levels, like with businesses designing their products to be more durable,
Right.
and with consumers making smarter choices about what they buy and how they dispose of things.
It's a lot to think about. I'm starting to feel a little overwhelmed by all of this.
I can understand that.
I mean, these goals, climate neutrality, a circular economy, they seem so huge. You know?
Yeah.
Where do we even begin?
Well, just think about Carlos again. Think about those changes that he's observing in his town.
Right.
All of those are examples of these EU policies in action. They might seem small by themselves, but when we add them up across lots of communities, they really multiply.
Okay, that's a good point.
Yeah, it's about taking those big goals and breaking them down into steps
Yeah.
that individuals and communities can actually take.
That makes a lot of sense.
Mhm.
So we've been talking about waste and resources, but the EU is also really focused on like clean water and clean air, which are obviously super important for a healthy environment and our own well-being.
Yeah, definitely. Clean water and air aren't just like abstract ideas. I mean, they're fundamental to our health and the health of the planet. And the EU has some really innovative policies in place to deal with these issues.
Okay, so beyond just setting goals, what are some concrete examples of how they're working to improve water and air quality?
Well, one great example is the EU Water Framework Directive.
Okay.
So this directive basically wants to make sure there's clean, healthy water all across Europe.
Okay.
Not just for drinking, but for everything, like all the ecosystems.
So they're taking a pretty comprehensive approach.
Yeah, we're thinking about the whole water cycle and how it all impacts the environment. And it also sets quality standards and encourages countries to manage their water in sustainable ways.
So it's not just top-down regulations.
Right.
It's about empowering local communities to take care of their own water resources.
Exactly. And if we go back to Carlos and his town,
Okay.
remember how they're collecting rainwater now and trying to conserve water? Those efforts fit right in with this directive.
Makes sense.
So you can see how local actions can actually contribute to these big EU objectives.
I like that. So what about air quality?
Well, the EU has also set up regulations to limit air pollutants. They're trying to reduce the amount of harmful stuff in the air we breathe.
So are those smog alerts we see sometimes related to these regulations?
Yeah, they can be. Those alerts usually happen when pollution levels get too high. And these regulations are designed to prevent those kinds of situations and just generally make the air cleaner.
So they're not just reacting to problems after the fact. They're trying to prevent them in the first place.
Exactly. And it's working.
Yeah.
Lots of cities across Europe have way better air quality now than they did before these regulations.
That's great.
Yeah. And Carlos's town has seen improvements too.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it shows how these policies can actually make a difference in people's lives.
Okay, so we've got clean water, clean air, all these interconnected things. Our sources also mention this EU biodiversity strategy for 2030.
Right.
What is that all about?
Well, that strategy is all about protecting and restoring natural ecosystems in Europe because they're realizing that biodiversity isn't just about, pretty scenery. It's actually crucial for regulating the climate and supporting all life on Earth.
Wait, so protecting nature actually helps fight climate change?
Yeah, absolutely. You see, ecosystems like forests and wetlands act as these huge carbon sinks. They absorb carbon dioxide from the air, and that helps fight climate change.
That's amazing.
Yeah, so by protecting and restoring nature, we're also creating a more stable climate.
So it's a win-win.
Exactly. And the EU biodiversity strategy has these ambitious goals, like they want to protect 30% of Europe's land and sea areas by 2030.
Wow.
And plant 3 billion trees.
That's incredible. But how does this connect to, like, my everyday life, What can I actually do to help?
Well, you'd be surprised what a difference small actions can make.
Okay.
Like, you could support local conservation efforts. You could plant native species in your garden.
Right.
You could even just reduce your use of pesticides.
Okay, so even small changes can contribute to a healthier ecosystem.
Exactly. And when everyone does a little bit, it really adds up.
It's kind of like those individual actions that we talked about before with climate neutrality. It's about realizing that we're all part of this, and we all need to do our part.
That's right.
So it's pretty amazing how the EU is putting all of these pieces together, like clean water, clean air, and even protecting biodiversity. It seems like they're trying to create this big interconnected vision for a greener Europe.
Yeah, definitely.
But we've also heard from some people who think that these policies are, well, a bit much.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, putting these big policies into practice across so many different countries with different, economies and political situations. It's really hard.
It's a huge undertaking,
It is, and sometimes all the rules and regulations can feel kind of overwhelming.
especially for like smaller companies or communities.
Yeah, exactly. For them, it could be difficult to keep up with all of the complexities.
So it's like they're trying to balance this big, ambitious vision with what's actually doable on the ground.
Yeah, and finding that balance can be tough. And some people say the EU needs to make things simpler
Mm,
and provide more support to help everyone actually follow these policies.
that makes sense.
And another thing that comes up is that the EU needs to do a better job of communicating the benefits of these policies.
Right. So people understand why it's all happening.
Exactly. Because if people don't understand, it's harder to get them excited about participating.
Yeah, and then there's the whole question of like, are they moving fast enough?
Yeah, some critics think that the EU needs to be more aggressive, especially when it comes to climate change.
Right, because it's such an urgent problem.
Exactly. So there's this tension between being really thorough and also being quick.
It's a tough balance.
It is. And of course, there's always the question of how to balance environmental protection with the economy and with social equity.
Yeah, because you don't want to harm certain industries or communities in the process.
Exactly. It's like trying to solve this really complex puzzle where all the pieces affect each other
Yeah.
and there's no easy answer.
It's definitely complicated, but it's good that the EU is actually listening to these criticisms
Oh, yeah.
and trying to make things better.
Yeah, it's a work in progress. They're always evaluating and refining things, which is good.
It's definitely an ongoing conversation.
It is. And we need to keep talking about it and keep looking for the best solutions.
Well, this has been a really fascinating deep dive.
It has.
We've learned so much about the EU's plans for a greener future and all the cool things happening on the ground, but also, the challenges that come with all of this.
Yeah, it's important to be aware of all of that.
It seems like the main takeaway is that sustainability is a journey, not a destination, right?
Absolutely. It's
Yeah.
about changing how we think and realizing that we're all connected to the environment.
And that our actions have a real impact.
Exactly. The EU is showing us one way forward, but ultimately it's up to each of us to do our part.
So as we wrap up, we want to leave you with this. How do you want to be a part of creating a greener future?
Yeah, think about the changes you can make, big or small.
Maybe you can choose more sustainable products. Maybe you can reduce your waste. Or
Right.
maybe you can even speak up and advocate for change.
Yeah, anything helps. And the most important thing is to stay curious, stay engaged.
Because we all share this planet.
That's right.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.